In 168 BCE, at this pivotal moment in history, the colossal might of Rome had undeniably asserted its undisputed dominion over the vast expanses of the Mediterranean. However, a mere glance at any map of the known territories from that era could hardly convey the full depth and comprehensive nature of Rome's overwhelming influence. This was not merely territorial supremacy, but total control, penetrating the very essence of other states' existence. Once proud and mighty Carthage, whose merchant fleets plied the seas and whose wealth seemed inexhaustible, had been crushed in 2 bloody wars. From then on, it was reduced to the status of a secondary power, its fate predetermined, its former glory a distant memory. Its extensive possessions on the Iberian Peninsula had long since come under the direct control of Roman legions, becoming an integral part of the Roman dominion. As for its African lands, their nominal independence was merely a temporary reprieve from the inevitable, lasting only a few decades before they too were absorbed by relentless Roman expansionism. Even the Hellenistic city-states, once centers of great civilizations and cultures, ostensibly retained their freedom. However, this freedom was only apparent, constrained by strict conditions. They were absolutely forbidden from waging war against each other. Rome, acting as the supreme arbiter, guaranteed the independence of each of these polis, but this guarantee effectively meant an unbreakable Roman protectorate, precluding any attempt at an independent foreign policy. The Macedonian kings, whose ancestors had once forged an empire stretching to the very borders of India, also suffered crushing defeats in 2 wars against Rome. Their sovereignty, though preserved at that moment, hung by a thread, and it was evident that it would last only a few short years before Macedon definitively passed under direct and irrevocable Roman rule. Meanwhile, in the eastern reaches of Anatolia, a new regional power emerged, the Kingdom of Pergamum, which became a reliable ally of Rome and a key element of its eastern policy. This kingdom gained its vast territories and rose to such influence not without Rome's involvement, specifically after the Eternal City expelled the powerful Seleucid king Antiochus the Great from Anatolia, solidifying this outcome with the famous Treaty of Apamea. During these events, Antiochus the Great's son was taken hostage by the Romans, becoming an unwitting witness to the grandeur and ruthlessness of Roman power. This hostage was none other than the future Antiochus IV Epiphanes. By the time in question, he had already returned home to ascend his father's throne and rule as the new king. But what consequences this return had for the future of the entire region, and what secrets this monarch, who had experienced Roman influence from within, held, this is but a small part of what remains to be discovered. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was an extraordinary personality, characterized by a highly peculiar nature. He appropriated the name Epiphanes, which loosely translated to God Manifest. However, in the mouths of some of his contemporaries, this title transformed into Epimanes, which essentially meant madman, a rather witty play on words with his self-proclaimed title. This ruler burned with a desire to follow in the footsteps of his great father, striving to resume the process of reviving the once mighty Seleucid Empire. Immediately upon his ascension to the royal throne, Antiochus paid close attention to maintaining favorable relations with the Roman Republic. As proof of his intentions, in 173 BCE, he dispatched a diplomatic mission to Rome, which delivered part of the still outstanding tribute owed under the terms of the Treaty of Apamea, concluded in 188 BCE. During its stay in the Eternal City, this embassy secured the renewal of the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance with Rome, thereby strengthening the Seleucids' diplomatic position. On the Egyptian throne at that time sat Ptolemy VI, Antiochus's blood nephew. This ruler had been forcibly placed on the throne by his influential uncle, with the aim of ensuring complete control over him and, consequently, over the entire state. However, the political situation in Egypt proved to be far more complex than Antiochus had anticipated. The people of Alexandria, dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, turned their gaze to Ptolemy VIII, Ptolemy VI's brother, and his sister Cleopatra II, to establish a rival government. Realizing that his influence in the region was rapidly waning, Antiochus made a strategic decision. He assembled his military forces and marched into Egypt in 168 BCE, pursuing the goal of restoring lost influence and strengthening his position. Preceding the land invasion, Antiochus dispatched a powerful naval fleet to seize Cyprus, an island under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Cyprus immediately capitulated to him. Soon after, Antiochus moved his numerous army into Egyptian territory, occupying Lower Egypt and setting up his extensive camp outside the strategically important city of Pelusium. The helpless King Ptolemy in Alexandria, unable to offer proper resistance to defend his domains, found himself in a desperate situation. Fortunately, however, he had influential patrons. He immediately sent a message to the Senate in Rome, urgently requesting military assistance against Antiochus's aggressive actions. Instead of dispatching its formidable legions to aid the besieged Ptolemaic kingdom, Rome chose a different path, sending only one man, Senator Gaius Popillius Laenas, accompanied by a small retinue. When Popillius approached Antiochus's camp, spread out beyond Pelusium, it became perfectly clear that the city would not be able to withstand Antiochus's onslaught for long. Its fall seemed a matter of days. Popillius, with an imperturbable demeanor, proceeded into the Seleucid camp, heading directly for the king's tent. Hearing of the arrival of envoys from Rome, Antiochus hastily came out to meet them, greeting them with a broad smile and extending his hand to shake Popillius's. However, Popillius, deeming it inappropriate to exchange traditional signs of friendliness before the intentions of the parties were clear, placed a scroll containing a copy of the senatorial decree in his hand, suggesting he read it first. This was a decree from the Senate and people of Rome, categorically ordering the king to immediately cease the war against their ally. After reading the document, Antiochus looked up and met the stern, unyielding faces of the Romans. He fully realized that he possessed sufficient forces to conquer Egypt unimpeded, and Ptolemy could offer only negligible resistance to his invasion. For a few moments, the king hesitated, stunned by such a categorical order. What could this small Roman retinue hope to achieve? He could easily dispose of them and put them to death on the spot. However, Antiochus fully understood that Rome was very resolute. After all, his own father, Antiochus the Great, had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BCE and was subsequently forced to cede a significant part of his possessions in Anatolia to the kingdom of Pergamum, an ally of Rome. What was a ruler to do in such a difficult position? Perhaps harboring a hope of achieving some compromise, he replied that he needed time to process the new information and consult with his advisors and close friends regarding further actions. He promised to call the Romans once he had made a final decision. However, Popillius, a man of stern character and unyielding will, approached Antiochus and, using the staff he held in his hand, drew a circle around the king. Then he declared, "Before you step out of this circle, give me an answer I can present to the Senate." These words unequivocally made it clear that Rome would declare war if the king left the drawn boundary without immediately committing to withdraw from Egypt. Antiochus was utterly stunned by Popillius's audacious behavior. He quickly and carefully weighed all the options available to him and ultimately agreed to withdraw his troops from both Egypt and Cyprus, precisely following the demands of the decree from the Senate and people of Rome. Immediately, Popillius's stern expression transformed. Smiling warmly, he approached to shake Antiochus's hand and embraced him, as if he were an old friend of Rome. Antiochus was undoubtedly deeply offended by what had transpired and, of course, expressed his dissatisfaction, but ultimately he was forced to yield to the circumstances. Ptolemaic